Celebrating 44 years on the air, Farm Week is a production of Mississippi State University Extension.
Today on Farm Week, they called it a Derecho, a hurricane without an eye that damaged millions of acres of cropland. Plus, what is ag's impact on the economy? The Federal Reserve weighs in. In Southern gardening, turn your backyard into a rainforest. And we begin a 5-part special report on the Mississippi flood of the century. We'll hear from those who lived through it. Farm Week starts right now. Hello everybody, I'm Mike Russell. Thanks for joining us today on Farm Week. As if COVID-19 and disruptions in trade weren't enough, extreme weather came calling on part of the country, including the Midwest. There, a storm known as a derecho wreaked havoc across 6 states, killing 22. The damage to property and crops will be in the billions. Farm Week's Jonah Holland has the story.
Corn farmers across the Hawkeye State are still assessing the damage after a storm packing high wind speeds laid waste to this year's crop. Last week, a derecho, or straight-line windstorm, leveled what was expected to be a record crop, with winds topping 100 miles per hour. Early estimates from state officials show up to 10 million acres have been impacted by this rare event. Described as a hurricane without an eye, the derecho storm did most of its damage in Iowa, wiping out millions of acres of corn and soybeans. Neighboring states Nebraska, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Michigan were also impacted along the storm's 770-mile journey. By the end of the week, 25 counties were declared disaster areas by Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds. Vice President Mike Pence visited Iowa later in the week as cleanup was well underway. For many farmers, that cleanup begins with one hand tied behind their backs as trade wars and the global pandemic continue to weigh down rural America.
In the near term, we have to decide, do we keep this crop for grain? Or do we try to get some forage value out of it, either as a green chop, feeding it fresh, to livestock, or do we try to ensile it for cattle down the road? And that decision is going to have to be made relatively quick.
According to the latest USDA supply and demand report, the 2020 corn crop, if realized, will come in at just over 15 billion bushels. Government officials are still trying to pinpoint exactly what kind of impact the storm will have on final crop numbers.
But just trying to think through number of acres of corn that were affected and percent yield loss and trying to average things out. We could be in the 150 million or more bushels, of total production that come up short this year. That will be a big thing.
The numbers we quote nearly every week are part of what the Fed is watching when it decides economic policy. We had a chance to speak with an economist at the Kansas City Federal Reserve's Omaha office. We began with a chat about the impact of the nation's large grain supply on the economy.
Yeah, so agriculture has a lot of linkages in this region, even if it's not farming directly, that plays into the economy, because manufacturing is tied to agriculture and transportation is tied to agriculture, and there's a number of communities that would be tied very closely to ag and banking. So the indirect effects of what happens in agriculture do spill over into the rest of the economy. In April, I would say, again, at the peak of the crisis, we worried a lot about sort of what the health of the industry might be. This was a time when ethanol plants were closing quite dramatically. Meat packing plants were closing because of COVID disruptions. Trade was a real question. The last couple of months, we've seen some of those things improve a little bit, and there have been some government support programs that I think have allowed some amount of relief to be able to offset the challenges. So while I think that there may be support that allows producers and the industry at large to get through 2020, I think going into 2021, those large supplies are likely to continue to weigh on prices and profits into next year, which is almost certain to affect then how producers will need to make decisions and how the industry positions itself going forward. So I think that when we try to get our assessment of what the markets might look like, we would certainly want to look at those fundamentals of supply and demand and take into account what's happening globally and trade flows and things that we know on the basis of data, but then recognize where there might be sources of uncertainty. And we may describe those as, you know, potential factors that are upside risks or things that would also be risks to the downside. So I think that we try to describe those that way, but it would be very difficult to try to forecast on the basis of potential policy, or even for a lender, for that matter, to make a decision on financing on the basis of what programs might look like in 2021. The markets look like they could be a challenge again, and there could be more financial stress. But in each of those years, there has been some sort of program then that has mitigated or offset some of the weaknesses that we probably would have observed without them. So that's sort of how we go about our discussion of the conditions, but recognizing that there's going to be risks to either side. You know, we obviously follow markets on a regular basis, but we're also paying attention to things that are broader than that. You know, pricing, not just from commodities, but even on the retail side of things, and tracking what's happening in terms of consumer behavior. This massive shift to consumption at grocery stores and supermarkets has big implications for what happens on the farms and producers from a raw material perspective. So, you know, we try to pay attention to all of those data points. We try to interact with as many people as we can. Like I said, we're coming off of a couple of weeks of a policy meeting, and now sort of starts the time leading into September where we are reaching out and formulating our questions that we want to understand going into our next FOMC meeting and policy cycle. So, you know, even having these sorts of conversations and taking questions from people, those are things that we will do quite regularly so that we have a better sense of how to think about the pulse of the industry in the region. But we've been trying to understand the impact of the pandemic on supply chains and supply chain disruptions. And so we will ask whether it's our contacts in the region or, you know, a specific industry, to what extent they may be experiencing challenges in the supply chain and how that might be factoring into any sorts of pricing pressures. So we've asked a lot recently about the health and strength of our supply chains, and it goes back to my comment about the shift in consumption to supermarkets as opposed to restaurants. And, you know, that holds a lot of, I think, importance for what happens in the broader economy in terms of how those supply chains might be holding up, both here and globally, because we do focus also on what supply chains look like across borders, you know, here in China and other places.
On the lighter side, if you're like most people, the sound of a babbling brook is very soothing, especially these days. So why not add that calming feature to your landscape? According to Gary Bachman, it can turn your yard into a rainforest. Here's Gary.
Water features are some of the most dynamic additions that can be added to a landscape. Today I'm going to show you one of the best water features I've seen. We're back visiting our friends Donna and Richie in Vicksburg. They've taken advantage of the natural steep incline in their backyard to add a great water feature. This place looks and feels like a tropical rainforest. It is so lush and green. The stream of this feature consists of multiple levels flowing over several waterfalls. Finally, it ends up in a nice fish pond at the bottom. Almost the entire stream is lined with rich and lavish sections of Lysomachia, along with abundant ferns. At the bottom, the pond is surrounded by rough rock and small boulders, giving it a very natural look. Many of the boulders feature patches of moss, and that's a nice touch. The front edge of the pond is planted with several varieties of lush color. There's lots of greenery, including ferns, cannas, lilies, and elephant ears. Today there's a showy section of phlox growing, along with the beautiful daylilies. On the side of the hill, bordering the water feature, are mass plantings of azalea and hydrangea. The endless summer hydrangeas are in bloom now, showing off their huge blue pom-poms of color. I can only imagine the spring bloom of the Formosa azaleas. One of my favorite features to a landscape is the sound of running water. This makes for a fantastic backyard retreat. I'm horticulturist Gary Bachman, and I hope you'll join me next time on Southern Gardening.
We'll take a short break, but don't go away. Coming up, last year, Mississippi's lower delta experienced an unprecedented backwater flood. Many of the residents who struggled through the 7 months of flooding felt the disaster could have been prevented. Coming up, we'll begin a 5-part series examining what happened, and we'll hear from some of those who lived through that catastrophe. Stay with us for part 1 of Voices from the Flood, coming up on Farm Week. Don't go away.
At Mississippi State University, Extension is reaching beyond the college campus and impacting adult education. We're instructing agricultural professionals on the latest trends in research and technology, inspiring communities, empowering small businesses, and promoting the growth of healthy families where youth and adults can reach their fullest potential.
The MSU Extension Service, sharing our vision for the future.
ATVs are a ton of fun for people of all ages, but these powerful machines can also be a ton of trouble if safety guidelines aren't followed. Never carry more than one person on a single ride or four-wheeler. The four-wheeler can become unstable and very dangerous. ATVs are designed for off-road use only. Never drive one on a highway or any other paved surface. And always ride the right size machine at the right speed. This message brought to you by MSU Extension 4-H.
It's a simple idea. Knowledge that transforms lives shouldn't be limited to those on a campus, but extended to any and all who want or need it, wherever they are. At Mississippi State University, we've been making that possible for more than 100 years through the MSU Extension Service. What began as an effort to extend the latest research to farmers has become something much more. Today, we're helping Mississippians from all walks of life, giving them the tools they need to build a brighter future. We're sparking the imagination of students around the state and inspiring the next generation of doctors. We're helping rural communities find their way to the internet and connect to the world at large. And we're teaching families how to lead healthier lives in ways both big and small. MSU is standing firm in its commitment to that one simple idea: extend the knowledge that transforms lives wherever they are.
Time now for the markets. Zach Ashmore here with more on that storm in the Midwest and with why the markets are up. Zach?
Thanks, Mike. Markets looking up last week, all futures in the green. Recovery seems slow but steady. Let's take a look. Last week's largest gain, lumber yet again. This time up $82, followed by soybeans up 30 cents. A lot of that due to the WASDE report, which we'll talk about in a moment, along with the Derecho that hit Iowa this past week. Suffice to say, we're seeing a rally in commodities offset by a big natural disaster. This month's WASDE report dropped last week. Let's dig into what the USDA has for us. U.S. wheat production raised 14 million bushels from last month. Higher exports and lower imports. Foreign wheat production lowered 3.7 million tons as well. U.S. corn looking up with higher supplies, stocks, and exports. Foreign corn production lowered with slightly higher trade and reduced stocks. U.S. rice projected lower supplies and reduced exports. Global rice outlook projects smaller supplies, lower consumption, trade, and ending stocks. U.S. soybeans show higher production, crush, exports, and ending stocks, while global supply projected higher production, use, and lower ending stocks. U.S. livestock, poultry, and dairy showing a mixed bag, with meat production lowered due to pork's slow rebound. For 2020 beef imports, fed cattle prices and milk production raised, while broilers and turkeys remain the same. And finally, U.S. cotton outlook projects production with a decrease in consumption. Global cotton projected higher production with lowered consumption and trade as well. As you saw earlier, markets are up. The WASDE report had something to do with that. Analyst Mark Gold says things looking good, soybeans in particular, mostly due to China buying with no signs of stopping for now.
You know, I love the fact when a market rallies and closes higher on a bearish report. That was positive. I like to see that. We've got the triple bottom in December corn at 320. We've got the double top in December corn at 363. That's kind of our parameters for the time being. But I'm hopeful that we can move this thing higher. The soybean market has had an enormous amount of Chinese buying. I think it was 7 days in a row now we've had some export sales to China. And I believe that what's happening in Brazil leaves us to be the only real seller available to the Chinese. And regardless of what we see or hear from them, they're going to be buying more beans, and I think ultimately corn and wheat as well.
As you saw earlier in the show, the Midwest struck by a massive derecho this past week. In Iowa alone, the corn industry hit hardest by heavy winds. The governor's office says around 10 million acres affected and rising. Market analysts Mark Gold and Ted Seifert say despite the damage, we're seeing the peak of corn and soybean production for the year. That means prices could rise based on WASDE report estimates.
Well, I think it's pretty serious. There was one estimate out today across the Midwest, 37 million acres. I think that's pretty high. But I think we're looking at total corn production losses of somewhere between 300 to 500 million between Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. I think that makes a big difference. I'm convinced that we have seen the high production numbers that we're going to see in both corn and beans this year. And those derechos, it blew through my apartment on the 38th floor. It almost took off my barbecue and a 80-pound plant. But thank God they were battened down and we were able to get through it. But it was bad.
I'm going to agree with Mark. I think we have seen the high watermarks for our corn and soybean production simply because that was as of August 1st, and we've had a lot of things happen as of August 1st. I'm surprised they got as aggressive as they did on soybean yield because that really is dependent on the weather in the month of August. And I look at the forecast, and to me, that doesn't seem ideal. So I see that coming down. And I think the market says the same thing. I mean, look at what happened. We got a really bearish report on soybeans there on Wednesday, and we rallied on that. We rallied on Thursday, ran into the 200-day moving average, which we haven't been over since the duration of the November soybean contract. Yeah, we took a little bit of a step back on Friday, but we look like we're poised to break out to the upside there in soybeans.
In future tech news, Leaps by Bayer and Temasek have formed a new company called Unfold, whose goal is research and development of vertical farming. We've covered the industry here before, but this new step shows major players getting into the game. Unfold will focus on certain crops that take well to the technique, most likely greens and garden vegetables. What's the bigger market picture? Well, if this new technique continues to prosper, it'll lower the amount of water and land required to produce, not to mention shorter production cycles and year-round operation. That means more produce, which means lower prices. And that's it for a deeper look into the markets. We're still going up and futures finding their way. That won't last, but for now, things look optimistic. Mike?
Thank you, Zach. We are about to tell you a story that's difficult to watch. If you live in Mississippi, you know all about it. If you don't, you may be surprised, mostly because it did not get a lot of attention in the national media. In 2019, well over 500,000 acres flooded in Mississippi's lower delta. It was a combination of relentless rain in the region and epic runoff from higher up in the nation. But there's much more to the story, and those who came through the catastrophe, many of whom lost their homes and everything in them, believe it could have been prevented. Today, with their help, we begin our 5-part story, Voices from the Flood.
It hurts to see everybody misplaced and out of place. My mom's out of place, my brother's out of place. All my friends and other family members out of place. It's just, I never seen nothing like that before in my life.
Some people just didn't have much. They just didn't have much to start with. They didn't have flood insurance, and they can't get flood insurance, and they lost everything.
It was the flood that never ended. 2019, the perfect storm that put 550,000 acres of the Mississippi Delta underwater. But it's actually a complicated story. The federal government long ago recognized that because the Mississippi River drains 31 states, it was in the country's best interest to develop a massive flood control system, which it did. Basically, one of those pieces is near the south end of the Delta, from Vicksburg north, east of the Mississippi River, and west of the Yazoo River. That land is the Yazoo Backwater area, a 1,550 square mile arrowhead of land that forms what some call a bathtub. At a drainage structure like this one, Steel Bayou, water in that backwater bathtub is released to the Yazoo River, which empties into the Mississippi, and it works just fine most of the time, unless the Mississippi is higher. That forces the Steel Bayou gates closed and keeps the water in the bathtub. That's when pumps become necessary, and they were authorized as part of the long-term Yazoo Backwater Area project. But toward the end, after everything else had been built, the door would be closed on that most essential part of the system, the pumps.
None of this had to happen.
Ann Dahl retired to Eagle Lake, in the flood zone not far from Steel Bayou, in 2018. Some of her property was destroyed in the flood. She's been blogging about it since, spearheading a grassroots effort to get the pumps installed.
The pumps were started, literally back in the 80s. They got caught up in a cost-sharing law that had been enacted that took us 10 years to prove that we should be grandfathered into that. So we fought that for 10 years. And it was 7 years of the Corps of Engineers going through new studies because so much time has passed. And by that time, the EPA and the environmentalist groups had kind of come into power, if you will, and ended up vetoing us building the pumps.
So, with the Mississippi River high like it was in 2019 and no way to open the Steel Bayou gates or pump the water out of the South Delta, it piled up. Why did the EPA veto the pumps, though there are 22 similar systems along the Mississippi River? It turns out that a number of environmental groups objected, saying that numerous animal habitats would be harmed. And they said there would be problems downstream, though the Corps of Engineers ultimately proved otherwise. And there were economic objections, too. Some opponents felt the $220 million price tag would be too high.
And of all the projects that are done in all the states of this same type, this is the only project that the pumps were not installed. Everybody else that has this has pumps. Just across the Mississippi River in Louisiana, their elevation is lower than ours. So they should have had flooding more, but they have the same system with the pumps. So the pumps keep it pumped out.
There's no question that the 2019 backwater flood was a disaster. Just under half of the 550,000 acres that were flooded were cropland. The Mississippi Levee Board says nothing was planted on those acres. Meanwhile, 686 homes were flooded, several highways were overtopped, and wildlife was decimated. On June 13th of 2019, the Levee Board says 2 people drowned trying to turn around near Holly Bluff. Had the pumps been in place, it says at least 109,000 acres of cropland would have been spared. No highways would have been overtopped, no homes flooded.
It wasn't a flood like you sometimes see, or probably more often than not see on television, where, something came up and flooded, there was a big storm or something like that, some sort of real natural disaster. To us, this is a man-made disaster because the project was put in to bring all the water to the South Delta and block it. Part of the project was to put pumps in to get it out, and it never happened.
Not debating who was right or who was wrong or what decisions were made right or wrong. Where we are now is we need the pumps. We need the EPA, the Corps of Engineers and all to get on board and get this project finished. It was funded, it was complete, it was designed, it just wasn't installed.
When water gets behind gates that are closed, levee systems, they pump it out, pump it into the Mississippi River. These pumps right here on the Yazoo Backwater area are the only pumps that have not been placed.
Despite the enormity of the flooding, the Yazoo Backwater disaster received almost no national attention. We asked residents what they wanted the world to know.
That it was man-made, that it didn't have to happen.
Basically, my little lesson from all this, personally, and the way I feel is, it might be bad, but we're gonna get through it. Some way, somehow, we're going to get through it. And we did. Are we going to have to go through it again? I don't know.
If they put those pumps in, I mean, our community will be a lot better. And most people, I believe, will come back and go back home. I myself, if they gonna put the pumps in, I would like to go home and build me a nice house there. But they really need to put the pumps in. We need those pumps.
A complicated and emotional story, and it turns out that the decision to veto the pumps may be reconsidered through 2021. But next week, in the meantime, we continue our 5-part special report. In part 2, more about how the flood in Mississippi's lower delta developed. In their own words, those who came through the flood describe how, when the water began to rise, they fought to save their homes and then had no choice but to give up and leave. Voices from the Flood, Part 2, next time on Farm Week. Remember, if you missed a story, look for past episodes of Farm Week on our website at farmweek.tv, and don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube as well. We'll see you next week. Thanks for watching. Stay healthy.